In our series of CPU revisits today, we're looking at the esteemed, or once esteemed, AMD Phenom II 1090T. The 1090T we last revisited in 2017, but now, as of 2020, it's become a 10-year-old part, and the age hasn't been too kind to it, but it's held on pretty well in some of these applications. With Intel's new 10 series CPUs dominating in gaming and offering a lot of upgrade paths for people interested primarily in gaming, and with AMD's 3000 series doing well all around, but mostly in production and winning in those applications, it's a good time for anyone still on a Phenom to consider an upgrade option. The Phenom II 1090T was $300 when it launched for 1K unit pricing, and that would put you about the same as the modern 3700X plus or minus $40, or the 10600K, about in the same range. So even if you're not on a 1090T from 2010, it's still interesting to see the performance change in a $300 part from 10 years ago and today, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this one. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic Cooling and its Liquid Freezer 2 line. Arctic is actively restocking its Liquid Freezer 2 coolers that rank among the top performers for CPU coolers right now, including on Ryzen CPUs. The Liquid Freezer 2 series is focused on high thermal performance and value, featuring a blackout design and including a VRM fan mounted on top of the pump block to help provide airflow over neighboring VRM heat sinks. Arctic has also started selling its P12 120 case fans. Learn more at the links in the description below. Some history then. The Phenom II 1090T is a 45 nanometer Thuban core, and this was 6 cores on one die. In this era, AMD was using space and astronomy themed names for its parts. There were Zosma chips as well, and those were Thuban chips, except with 2 cores disabled. The 1055T launched alongside the 1090T. That was in April of 2010, and this was right around when Intel's Nehalem was starting to get to the point where it was about to be replaced, or had just been replaced. It was around that era with Sandy Bridge. So Nehalem was a crazy strong product, but it was one of those where the replacement, Sandy Bridge, was miles better than the original in the Core series for this most recent generation of Intel Core products. So AMD had the Phenom 2s out. They were extremely competitive, but they did face immediate Intel competition almost right upon launch. And then the Bulldozer line came after that, which was a disaster, put it nicely, for AMD. So April 2010 is about what we're looking at for this one. It was higher clock and more expensive than the 1055T, but that was the real difference. The Phenom II 1090T has SSE3 support, but it does not have SSS E3 support, with that third S being an important distinction. So that would be supplemental streaming single instruction multi-data extension 3 support. And this means that some of the newer applications struggle to run on the 1090T, the Phenom series, if they run at all, and we'll see some of those issues in some of the benchmarks today. The CPU is also interesting because it supports ECC memory, and although we didn't use that here, it was one of the options that might have been appealing to AMD users at the time. The top of the line Phenom II CPUs launched later in the year, in December of 2010, and that would include the 1100T. These were somewhat tragically and quickly followed up and replaced by Bulldozer in 2011, and in some applications tested at the time, back then when both were new, it was often a struggle for Bulldozer to maintain a lead or even have a lead at all against the Phenom II CPUs. They were that good when they came out, or Bulldozer was that bad, depending on how you look at it. That said, with the scope of time, it's stretched out a bit and they've gotten further apart. For other provenance, the T in 1100T, 1090T, and so forth stands for turbo, as in turbo boost. And the turbo boost cutoff here is 3 cores, where if 3 cores or more are idle, then the idle cores are downclocked and the active cores are brought up in frequency. That's how it worked for this generation. So the 1090T CPUs are also backwards compatible with AM2 Plus boards. This is actually a really interesting facet that we won't look into today because we used a DDR3 platform instead, but it meant that there was DDR2 support if you wanted it, and this made the switch over between DDR2 and 3 much less painful, because every time there's a DDR change, it is an expensive upgrade for people, and often people have memory from the previous generation left over that they might be able to bring forward if the platform supports both. The downside to this is that it does take die space, it does add cost, even if you're keeping the same size die with or without it, something else could go there. And if you're increasing the size of the die for that DDR2 and 3 support simultaneously, then you're dealing with a higher cost because the die is bigger. And then that could have been maybe something else in the silicon. And then finally, for the clock setup, the FSB is set to 200 stock for this platform. Its max multiplier is 4. And for our overclocking, we ended up doing a 233 FSB. We ran the memory at 1600. That came out to 1864 with the overclock. So that's 233 times 4 times 2 for DDR. 4 is the multiplier. And that's how we ended up overclocking the CPU on the FSB side of things, and the other notes are in the charts as always. So let's get into it. We've got some games and production workloads and power to look at today and see how the 1090T performs in 2020. Just like with the FX CPU, we want to start with a look backwards in time to an old game so that we begin with a representation of what high-end CPUs had to deal with in 2015. There's only one problem here. GTA 5, although it came out in 2015 for PC, still came out 4 to 5 years after the Phenom II X6 1090T and 1100T CPUs. The FX 8370 came out in 2014, and it refreshed a 2012 CPU, which itself was a refresh of a 2011 CPU. AMD had several stagnant, boring years in this period, and the Phenom II didn't perform as poorly as you'd expect relative to what AMD put out in 2014 with its refresh in the 8370. In this test, the stock 1090T allowed the FX 8370 a lead of only 21%. Considering the age gap between these, that's really not all that impressive. The Phenom II held competitively high 0.1% lows against the 8370 and had proportional frame time pacing against its average of 41 FPS. A modern reference might be the 2-core 4-thread 3000G at 54 FPS average, which was $50 at launch. The 1090T's $300 launch price means if you're buying in the same class, you'd align with the 3700X at about $270 right now, or the 10600K. The 3700X runs 109 FPS average, improved 170% over the 1090T. The 10600K runs a bit higher still, at 114 before overclocks. In the modern era, the 1090T is most comparable to a 3000G, and even that's 33% ahead. The rare 3500X would be the modern AMD 6-core 6-thread CPU, and that is still 160% ahead at 105 FPS average, with lows around 70. The overclocked 1090T has a massive 24% jump to 50.2 FPS average, which beats the FX 8370 stock, and even reaches 3000G performance. This was in the era where we really saw a lot from overclocks, and it was the same for Intel back then. A lot of that is just because companies have now gotten better than they used to be at maxing out the CPUs for stock performance. This is where we would normally show Hitman 2, but it doesn't work on the Phenom II. This is a bigger issue with older CPUs where some applications just don't cooperate. In some instances, like with Time Spy, that's because it's missing certain instruction sets, like SSS E3, where you'd find them on the newer CPUs. There's no fixing this, and overclocking doesn't help, so the Phenom II gets a failing grade for our DX12 Hitman 2 test. Hitman would work with DX11, but we don't have a benchmark for that or data for it, so we didn't run it. If you really had to play the game though, you could go to DX11 for it. While we're on the topic, Red Dead 2 was another one with issues. We were able to get to the menus, but we were unable to load the single player game or the built-in benchmark in either DX12 or in Vulkan. There might be a way around this somewhere out there if we really looked around on forums and tried to hack it together, but for purposes of benchmarking where we're not actually desperate to play the game, we consider this a fail. Total War 3 Kingdoms is our newest Grand Campaign game on the bench. The Empire or Napoleon games would have been the more recent ones at the time of the 1090T launch, just for perspective of how things have changed since. In the Grand Campaign test, the 1090T ran 41.6 FPS average. So the 3000G only holds a 26% lead here. At 2 cores and 4 threads, we can really see what modern instruction sets, cache configurations, memory, and more predictive architectures do for computing. The FX 8370 stock CPU leads the 1090T at 54 FPS average, so basically tied with the 3000G, except with worse 0.1% lows and therefore worse frame time consistency. Modern upgrades would include the 3600 at 121 FPS average and about half the price of the original 1090T price. The 3700X at 125 FPS average, which will benefit more in workstation workloads than gaming, mind you, and the 10600K at 138 FPS average would be the ones to look at for a more price-to-price upgrade. The overclock pushed the 1090T another 10 FPS higher, and that's impressive, but stability was on edge and the frame time consistency dipped. The OC got the 1090T up to 3000G equivalents and averages, but not lows, so these modern CPUs still have advantages even when they're equal in the average, and a lot of that can come down to things like branch prediction getting much more advanced now than it ever was 10 years ago. F1 2019 is next, a frequency-friendly title that isn't as thread-bound as some other games. Its frame rate scales so high on these GPUs that it's rare that we run into GPU bottlenecks, although that's functionally impossible on this CPU. The Phenom II X6 1090T ran at 69 FPS average originally, with its borderline stable overclock gaining 16.6% to 81 FPS average. The 3000G ran 46% faster, stock to stock, and that's the same for the 8370, which was equivalent in average performance to the 3000G. That said, the 8370 was lower in frame time consistency, which we discussed in our revisit of that CPU a couple days ago at this point, and even the 1200, which is a low-end part from 2017, managed 60% higher performance than the stock 1090T. Modern upgrade options include the 10600K, leaping so high in frame rate that it becomes stupid to use percentages as a comparison because they start losing any meaning, or maybe the 3700X, which does similarly, albeit a bit lower in maximum performance. As stated in the 8370 revisit, this is typically where we would talk about 1440p, but there's no point. We're so far from a GPU limit that the numbers are identical for the low-end parts, so the only thing that it does truncate is the really high end. The Division 2, like F1, runs pretty well on most devices. The average looks fine for the 1090T here, and it's surprising how well this old workhorse has held up. That said, it's suffering in the lows, and the 3000G shows significant advantages in frame time consistency despite its close average result. This is the benefit of a modern architecture, and is also why comparing just cores to cores without regard to the backbone of the architecture is a fool's errand. The FX 8370 ran well at 95 FPS average, but also suffered from poor frame time pacing. So, although it's good in a somewhat objective sense, at least for the average, comparatively it's still behind. Upgrades that make sense could again be the 3700X, which isn't listed here because we haven't rerun it yet, but it's about where the 3600 is. The 10600K would be a good gaming-focused build option, and as for overclocking the 1090T, we'll highlight those numbers as well, where if you're still on one of these, which probably not a lot of you are, it may be worth considering an overclock. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. In this one, the 1090T maintained 48 FPS average, with lows down at 22 FPS, 0.1%. That's not great, and despite being a mostly playable 48 for the average, the inconsistent frame pacing, or frame-to-frame interval, begins to introduce stutters to gameplay. The FX 8370 did actually maintain higher averages than in some other games, at 40% boosted over the 1090T. But its 67 FPS average still has it below the Pentium, the modern one, and just ahead of an R3 1200 from 2017. Jumping to the 3700X would boost 212% to 149 FPS average, which might as well be accompanied with a monitor upgrade at that point, where you'll actually be able to leverage a higher refresh rate. The 10600K would boost further to 163 average, stock, or 174 with an overclock and cache ratio tune. Finding a used 1700 would be more than double the performance of the 1090T average FPS, but would significantly improve frame time consistency and perceived fluidity in the games. The modern Intel parts do the same, as Ryzen isn't magically smoother than Intel's price-for-price parts in 2020 gaming, but anything would be a big improvement. The 1090T OC entry jumps 17% to 56 FPS average and is between the 3000Gs and not far from the 1200. We're getting to production benchmarks next, which is where you'll see more distinction between the modern AMD parts. In gaming, for the most part, the 3000 series largely ends up clustered around the same small range of results, which you've just seen. For production workloads, the higher core count parts begin to break rank in a big way. If you're more interested in doing stuff outside of gaming, just with some gaming on the side, then the Ryzen parts would be the ones to look at in these charts. If gaming is of most interest with some production on the side, the 10600K probably still makes the most sense. Up first is Blender 2.81 with the Cycles renderer, using our Monkey Head CPU stress test that we purpose-built for benchmarking CPUs. The 1090T required 81 minutes to complete the render when stock, and dropped an impressive and appreciable 25% off of the total render time with an overclock. The stock result has it next to the G5500 2-core 4-thread part, which today isn't great, but it's also old and tired. The overclock gets it ahead of the 2-core, 4-thread, 4 GHz 3000G, and it's behind the FX8370 stock CPU, which leads by 14%. That said, there's a gigantic crevice between the Ryzen 3000 parts and the FX and Phenom parts. The 3300X, which we wouldn't recommend for people commonly rendering on the CPU, manages a 26-minute time to complete. That's a 68% reduction against the stock 1090Ti. More reasonable upgrade paths would include the 3600 stock CPU, the 3700X stock CPU, and the 3900X if the budget can stretch an extra $100 or so to $400. The 10600K does okay here, but it'd mostly be for people who do more gaming than work rather than the other way around. The GN logo render makes everything worse in terms of total time required, but doesn't rearrange the stack too much. The 1090Ti now takes 112 minutes, or 88 overclocked, whereas a modern architecture 4-core 8-thread 3300X completes in 33 minutes. The 3700X, which is the most dollar-for-dollar AMD upgrade, ignoring parts that shouldn't exist, like the 3800X, finishes this in 17 minutes, and that's a reduction of 85% against the 10-year lifespan of the 1090Ti. It's also more power efficient on the newer parts too. Adobe Premiere rendering is next. For this, we're rendering our 1080p 60 show floor report. This is an ENG or an RNG shoot for those of you familiar with this type of work, and that's on each CPU in the charts. Note that the IGP doesn't accelerate anything in these tests. We don't enable it for these, and even if we were to enable it, because this particular project does not benefit them, you would see no change. Either way though, the Phenom II doesn't have an IGP, so that makes it pretty simple. The 1090Ti is outperformed by the stock 8370 CPU by an impressive 30%. But the modern $100 3100 finishes in 6.5 minutes, which is a reduction of 57%. Modern $300-ish CPUs would put you at 3.8 minutes for the 3700X and 5 for the 10600K, with diminishing returns on this project file as you get towards the top because it's a lighter weight workload. The 4K 60 render stretches the timescale and does so in a way that really distorts the performance of these older CPUs. The 1090Ti for a B-roll heavy 4K 60 render runs 52 minutes for the render time, and our overclock failed for these tests, so we'd have to drop it down to get a successful completion on the OC. The 3000G, for point of reference, is about adjacent to the stock 1090Ti, and the 3700X offers a reduction of 79%, so if you render videos even once per day, it'd be a noticeable change to get that amount of time back. Chromium compiling is our next one, and it's our measure of programming total project compile performance. Keep in mind that, just like Premiere, this is a type of workload or application that varies heavily based on the type of code being compiled in this instance, the operating system, the environment, and everything else. So we can't represent everything ever with one test, but it gives us a baseline idea for something standardized. In this test, the 1090Ti actually outpaces the Athlon 3000G, which is behavior we observed in the 8370 as well. It's one of the only tests where that happens. The 3000G ends up down around 500 minutes, while the 1090Ti requires 352 minutes against the 8370's 301. The 3700X completed this in under 1/3 the time at 91 minutes, and the 10600K required 132. As for the 3600, that splits the difference between them, while being cheaper than both. Finally, we'll look at a quick power test just for a fun reference point to the efficiency changes with time. The original 1090Ti required about 83 watts to run our Blender all-core workload, which is measured after a 5-minute point to allow for tau expiry on Intel CPUs with boosting time limits. 83 watts has it about equal to the 1600AF, which, if you don't know, is a 2600, or the 3700X. The 10600K runs about 104 watts, and as for the improvement or the efficiency, considering the 10600K was often hundreds of percentage points ahead of the Phenom II, the 20% higher or so power consumption isn't all that bad on that one. As for the Phenom II X6 1090Ti OC, our 1.475 volt set, that is the set voltage, not the get voltage, had it at 170 watts, which is around where the 3900X stock results were, and not far below the 3990X 64-core CPU. That said, we could have tuned this voltage lower, but we ended up running with this just to get it to stability and through the benchmarks. Because on the time scale we run for these revisits, time became more of an enemy than just trying to tune the voltage down. Even still though, obviously these older CPUs are going to be less efficient, where efficiency is looking at the work completed in a given time and considering the power consumption. So you're looking at 170 watts for something that completes the Blender tasks in orders of magnitude slower than a 3900X at about 20 watts lower than that still. So that's it for the benchmarks. The 1090T mostly was interesting, at least looking backwards now, for its overclocking potential. And there's more still we could do. We didn't overclock this CPU. We weren't enthusiasts of this CPU when it came out. So certainly those of you who maybe spent a lot of time on it back in the day could produce a better overclock. But even still with the one that we produced, which was about the max stable that we could get running on the platform with a 280mm CLC, even still, we're looking at sometimes 20% performance increases or a little bit more against baseline stock. And that's crazy good. You don't see gains that large for most overclocks today. Typically, if you do, you start getting into things like memory tuning for Ryzen or Intel alike. So that kind of gain, it's not that common anymore, at least for a simpler overclock without touching memory. And that's just because the companies, AMD and Intel, have both gotten better at stretching out the maximum performance of the silicon when it's running stock, which makes sense because most people don't overclock, and getting it as close to the limit as possible does mean they can stretch out the manufacturing for longer, which is beneficial for everybody, really. If you're still on a Phenom II CPU, then that's awesome. Definitely hats off to you for reducing your footprint and waste by stretching out the computers as long as you possibly can. We always encourage that. And unfortunately, it's kind of the end of the road for 1090T users. There's not much of an in-socket replacement you could do other than an 1100T. And the architecture is just so aged at this point that it might not even matter if you get a bit of a clock bump or a silicon quality bump. So like with the Intel series, the 4000 parts, the 4690K, there's actually a good in-socket option to the 4790K if you can find one for cheap, which is really uncommon, but it does mean you're buying fewer parts, you can stretch out a little longer, and there's a meaningful performance uplift. The Phenom series, the only way you're getting that is if you upgrade from a 1055T or something like that to an 1100 or a 1090, and they're not necessarily cheap, and they're also, again, just kind of old now. So might be time for an upgrade. The ones to consider would again be a 3700X, about 270 bucks. If you've been out of the loop, we generally advise against the 3800X or XT, especially the XT. Don't buy that. If you're considering a 3800 XT, go buy a 3900X instead. It's the same MSRP at least. They're about $400 for each of them, but you get significantly more cores at 12 for the 3900X, and the frequency doesn't really help in gaming where it should on the 3800 XT. So for the 3800X, if you're talking $10 difference against the 3700X, sure, go for it. But for the most part, there's not much meaningful uplift in anything. There might be a silicon quality uplift on average, but paying for that it's always kind of weird unless you're into enthusiast type overclocking or tuning. So 3700X makes a lot of sense at that price point. We didn't used to like the 3700X where it launched, but now that it has come back down, or come down rather in price because of the launch of other XT CPUs from AMD, it's actually starting to make a lot of sense and working its way into our favor. If you want something cheaper, 3600 makes a lot of sense as an all-arounder, but the 10600K would be our top choice for a gaming-focused system right now. Extremely easy to tune, really good performance, top performance in games, and it can match a 10900K with relative ease if you do some tuning on it. Now, it's going to have a lower ceiling still, but at some point you do start hitting a GPU limit. So 10600K is our choice for gaming, and then the 3700X is a good consideration on the production side. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus or store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, and we'll see you all next time.